There is something about water that the rational mind was never built to handle. Not the look of it, not the sound of it, the fact of it. The way it draws a hard line between you and everything familiar. The way it transforms escape from a reflex into a decision. You do not simply walk away from an island. You have to choose to leave. You have to find a boat, find the right tide, find a window in the weather. And until all of those things come together, whatever is on that island with you stays on that island with you. That is not a metaphor, that is geography. And it is the one thing every single person in tonight's stories failed to account for before they made their booking, loaded their equipment, or dropped anchor in unfamiliar shallows. The three people in tonight's stories were not thrill seekers. They were not amateur paranormal investigators or urban explorers looking for something to film. They were ordinary people in ordinary circumstances. A woman burning out from months of overwork who needed silence more than she needed anything else. A civil engineer on a routine structural assessment of a decommissioned facility. A marine surveyor doing a solo run he had done dozens of times before along a coastline he had helped chart himself. Normal jobs, normal reasons for being on the water, and every single one of them came home carrying something they were not expecting and have not been able to put down since. Because what they found on those islands had no business being there. And in more than one of these accounts, whatever was out there already knew they were coming before they had even stepped off the boat. Stay with me tonight. This is going to be a long one. Welcome back to Silent Fear, the channel where the most unsettling stories are always the ones that actually happened. If you are new here, I am genuinely glad you found us. Though I will say, the stories lined up for tonight are not ones you want to hear in a dark room by yourself. Find a light, find a blanket, maybe let someone know you are awake. You have been warned. Before we get into the first story, drop a comment right now and let me know where in the world you are watching from. We have people joining us from every corner of the globe, and I love seeing where this community reaches. And if you have not subscribed to Silent Fear yet, please do it before we get going. Hit that button below, turn on the bell so you never miss an upload, and know that it genuinely keeps this channel going. Every single subscription matters more than you think. 3 stories tonight. All of them real, all of them set on islands, all of them reported by people who had no motive to fabricate, no audience to perform for at the time, and no clean, rational explanation waiting on the other side of their experience. The thread connecting them is not the supernatural. I will leave that for you to decide once you have heard what happened. The thread is something simpler and something considerably more disturbing. In each of these accounts, whoever else was out there on that water already knew the narrator was coming, and they were ready. The first story comes from a woman I'm going to call Emily. She is in her mid-30s now, lives in New England, works in marketing. She submitted this account herself and asked that certain identifying details be changed, which I have done. Her words have been lightly formatted for narration, but the events are reported exactly as she described them. This happened about 4 years ago, she wrote, in the last week of September. I had just come out of a stretch that I can only describe as a slow collapse. Not dramatic. Nothing broke all at once. It was more like everything in my life had been running slightly too hot for slightly too long. And one morning I woke up and realized that nothing felt like mine anymore. Not my work, not my apartment, not the routines I had built around myself. I was going through the motions of a life and watching myself do it from somewhere slightly outside my own body. My doctor had told me, not for the first time, that I needed to step away. Not a vacation in the conventional sense, not a resort or a city break with a packed itinerary, just silence. Just a few days of genuine, unscheduled nothing. A coworker had mentioned a small island off the coast of Maine. Not one of the well-known ones with the whale-watching boats and the painted cottages and the restaurants. Something smaller, seasonal, the kind of place that empties out by the first week of September and stays that way until the following June. He said if you stayed overnight, you essentially had the whole island to yourself. That you could walk the perimeter in the evening and not pass another soul. That was the detail that reached me. The idea of an entire island with no one else on it felt at that specific moment in my life like the closest thing to a cure I could imagine. I found a rental listing within an hour of searching. A small cottage, 2 rooms, a wood stove, a porch that faced directly out over the water. The listing photos were washed out and overexposed in that particular way that tends to suggest the photographer was compensating for something and the price was suspiciously low for the season. In hindsight, both of those things should have made me more cautious rather than less. But I was exhausted and I was not in a cautious headspace, and I booked it without reading all the reviews through. The ferry crossing took about 25 minutes. The island was small enough to take in its full shape from the water, maybe 1.5 miles end to end, dense with pine and spruce. A cluster of weathered gray buildings visible near the only dock. There were day visitors on the boat with me, couples, a few families, a man with a large professional camera around his neck. I watched them file off the ferry and fan out across the island, and I remember the thought I had very clearly. By the time it gets dark tonight, every single one of these people will be gone. And at that point in my life, that thought felt like medicine. The cottage was reached by a gravel path that wound through the tree line, set back from the water by about 100 yards. I picked up the key from a lockbox on the porch. The owner managed everything remotely, and I had never spoken to them directly. The place itself was exactly as described. Small, clean, quiet. The specific quality of quiet that you only notice when you have been too loud inside your own head for too long, and you finally stop and realize what you have been missing. The first evening was exactly what I needed. I sat on the porch until the sun was completely down, watched the light change on the water, ate a sandwich I'd brought from the mainland, and went to bed before 9 o'clock. I fell asleep within minutes and slept deeply and without interruption for the first time in months. When I woke the following morning to nothing but the sound of the water and the trees and the distant calls of seabirds, I thought. And I remember this specific thought. I thought, maybe things are actually going to be okay. That feeling lasted until mid-morning of the second day. I had gone out for a walk along the shoreline path that circled most of the island. It was a cool, gray morning. Calm water, no wind to speak of, no one else visible in any direction. I was maybe a quarter mile from the cottage when I noticed something tucked in behind a natural rock formation just off the path. A spot half sheltered from the open shoreline, barely visible unless you were walking slowly and looking carefully. Dragged up above the tide line and resting on the gravel was a small aluminum skiff. No motor, no markings of any kind. Just the hull and a single wooden oar laid across the seats. On its own, a small boat resting on a Maine island is not remarkable. People keep skiffs. Locals use them for all kinds of reasons. I knew all of that, and I accounted for all of that as I stood there looking at it. But the thing that stopped me was the hull itself. It was wet. Not salt spray wet or morning dew wet. Wet in the way that a boat gets. When it has recently been in the water still beating and running off the aluminum, the wooden oar dark with it all the way through. And there had been no rain overnight. And I had not seen a single other person on that island since the last ferry pulled away from the dock the previous evening. I stood there and looked at that boat for what was probably a full minute. Then I walked back to the cottage and did what exhausted, rationalization-prone people do when they want something to be nothing. I told myself it was nothing. The second thing happened that afternoon. I had been reading on the porch when I became aware, in that slow, delayed way that takes a moment to catch up to you consciously, that the sounds of the woods had stopped. Not faded gradually, stopped. One breath there was birdsong and wind moving through the pine needles and the background creak of the trees, and the next breath there was complete and total silence. Not the comfortable silence of a peaceful place. The silence that an environment makes when something in it has shifted. The kind that does not feel like an absence of sound, but like a presence of something the rest of the natural world has decided to pay very close attention to. I sat very still on that porch for a moment, and then from the tree line, from somewhere in the brush between the cottage and the shoreline, maybe 30 or 40 feet away, there was a single sound. A branch snapping. One clean, deliberate crack of the specific kind that is made by something placing weight carefully, not by wind or by the random settling of old wood. Then silence again, complete and immediate. I went inside and locked the door. I am not someone who panics easily. I want to be honest about that, because I want you to understand how considered my fear was at that point. I was not spiraling. I was not convincing myself of something. I was responding to a sequence of events that had a logic to it. The sudden total environmental silence, followed by a single deliberate sound from a specific location, followed by nothing. And that logic had a name that I was not yet ready to give it. That night I did not sleep the way I had the first. I woke repeatedly and lay in the dark, listening, which is the worst possible response to an unfamiliar quiet, because the more intently you listen to silence, the more it seems to move around you. It acquires texture. It breathes. Every sound the cottage made on its own, the wood settling as the temperature dropped, the wind coming off the water and pressing against the walls, the creak of the porch. Every one of those ordinary sounds went through me like a current. I kept telling myself I was overreacting. I kept running through the list of reasonable explanations. A local fisherman who keeps a spare skiff in that cove. An animal in the brush, heavier than it sounds. A perfectly ordinary Maine island with perfectly ordinary things happening on it. I was almost convinced. I was 3/4 of the way back to sleep when I heard the footsteps. I am going to say that plainly because I want there to be no ambiguity about it. Not sounds that I was interpreting as footsteps. Not my frightened brain finding a pattern in random noise. Footsteps. The specific, unmistakable weight and rhythm of a person walking across a wooden porch. Slow and unhurried, moving from the left side to the right, then stopping directly in front of the door. I did not breathe. I did not move a single muscle. I lay in that bed completely locked. Then the knock came. 3 of them, evenly spaced, patient in a way that somehow was far worse than urgency or force would have been. 3 knocks from someone who was not in a hurry, someone who was comfortable, and then a voice, low, conversational, warm even in a way that made it worse rather than better. I saw your light on earlier. Just wanted to make sure everything was okay with the cottage. The owner managed the property remotely. That had been made explicitly clear at the time of booking. There was no on-site caretaker. There was no maintenance person. There was no reason for any living human being to be standing on that porch at 2 a.m. with a reason to knock on the door of a woman sleeping alone inside. I did not answer. I did not make a sound. I lay there in that bed, and I waited and I prayed. After what felt like 3 or 4 minutes, though I have no real way of knowing because time had stopped behaving normally, the footsteps crossed the porch again. They went down the wooden steps. They crunched slowly and without urgency into the gravel path. And then they were gone. I did not sleep after that, not a single minute. I lay in that bed with every light off and every muscle tense until the sky outside the window had turned from black to gray to the pale, flat white of an overcast dawn. Then I got up, packed my bag in about 4 minutes, and walked to the dock. I sat on a bench and waited 3 hours and 50 minutes for the first morning ferry. The island looked completely empty. I saw no one. But on my way to the dock, I walked past the section of sheltered shore where I had found the skiff the morning before. It was gone. In the place where it had rested above the tide line, the gravel was freshly disturbed. 2 long parallel drag marks ran from the spot where the hull had been all the way to the water's edge. As though something heavy had been hauled back into the sea very recently, I filed a report with the rental platform. I called the county sheriff's non-emergency line and filed a report there as well. Both times I was told my concern had been noted and would be passed along. I have no idea whether anything was ever done. I've never been back to that island, and I have no intention of returning. But the part I have not been able to resolve, the part that surfaces in my mind at 2 a.m. more often than I would like, is this. Whoever was out there came by boat. They crossed to that island specifically in the dark and beached their skiff in a sheltered spot that was not visible from the cottage. Then, in the middle of the night, they walked to the door and knocked. They knew which cottage had a guest. They knew someone was inside. And the voice they used was the voice of someone with a reasonable cover story already prepared. Not threatening, not urgent, just a neighbor checking in, just someone making sure everything was okay. They waited. They got silence. They walked away. And before the morning ferry could carry a single witness to that island, they had taken their boat and gone. The knock was patient, practiced, like someone who had stood on that porch before, like someone who had learned across many visits exactly how long to wait before walking away. That is the detail that will not leave me. Not the fear I felt in that moment, but the certainty that comes with it. Whatever that person was doing, they had done it before. And the fact that I did not open the door does not mean they stopped. Take a breath. Because the second story takes us somewhere different. Not a cottage on a Maine island. A decommissioned industrial site in the Pacific Northwest. And the man at the center of it is about as far from someone prone to fear as it is possible to be. I want to say one more thing about Emily's account before we move on, because it is the detail I keep returning to when I think about all three of these stories together. The knock came at 2 in the morning. Not midnight, not 3 or 4. When the sky begins to soften and the brain starts to claw its way back toward rationality. 2 in the morning is the specific hour when human beings are at their most physiologically vulnerable, when the nervous system is deepest in its rest cycle, when the instinct to freeze overrides every other instinct, when the space between asleep and awake is wide enough that you genuinely begin to question your own perceptions. Whoever was on that porch understood that. They chose that hour deliberately. And that kind of deliberateness is its own category of disturbing, entirely separate from whatever they actually wanted. The second account was submitted by a man I will call Andrew. He is a civil engineer in his early 40s. He describes things in measurements and timestamps. His account uses phrases like debris distribution pattern and structural load envelope. He is precise, methodical, and by his own description, a skeptic by nature and by professional training. He told me he spent years after this happened actively searching for the most boring and mundane explanation for what he witnessed. He has not found one. I want to be upfront about something before I get into this, he wrote. My entire professional life is built on observable, verifiable, repeatable evidence. If a structure holds, there is a reason grounded in physics. If it fails, there is a reason. I do not deal in ambiguity, and I do not deal in the unexplained. What I am about to describe is the single exception to that in over 20 years of professional practice, and I am still not entirely at peace with the fact that it exists. This happened 11 years ago during a contracted structural assessment of a decommissioned industrial facility. The site is not something I can identify publicly. Confidentiality agreements from that engagement remain in effect. But it was an island, small, roughly 3 miles in length, situated in a protected bay approximately 7 miles offshore in the Pacific Northwest. A processing facility had operated there and closed permanently sometime in the 90s. What remained on site was a combination of partially demolished structures and buildings simply left in place to deteriorate. Andrew and his partner had been contracted to assess the structural condition of the remaining buildings ahead of a planned environmental remediation project. His partner on the job he calls James, experienced, detail-oriented, and familiar with the site. James had completed a preliminary walkthrough approximately 8 months prior and had described the island as straightforward, grim in the way that all decommissioned industrial sites are grim, but nothing unusual. They crossed on a contractor's vessel on a Tuesday morning in October, a 40-minute run. They tied up at the old facility dock, the only functioning dock on the island, and began working south to north through the site, documenting structures as they went. The first several hours were completely routine. Deteriorated buildings, some light evidence of casual trespass by boaters over the years, debris and water damage in the expected quantities and locations. Nothing that surprised either of them. Andrew describes it as exactly what James had led him to expect. Things changed when they reached the northern end of the island in the early afternoon. The structures up there were older than the main facility, predating it by several decades, and in significantly worse condition. James had flagged them as low priority in his preliminary report, which was why they had been left for the end of the day. There was a long, low building near the northern perimeter. Single-story concrete block, approximately 60 feet in length. The roof had partially collapsed at the eastern end. The western section was still structurally intact. Andrew went in through a window opening, while James documented the exterior. Inside, the floor was covered in the expected accumulation: broken glass, fallen insulation panels, years of water infiltration leaving rust blooms and softened sections across the concrete. Andrew was working his way toward the intact western end when he noticed something inconsistent about the debris pattern on the floor. In a sealed and undisturbed building, debris settles and distributes itself more or less uniformly over time. It layers. It compacts into itself. What Andrew was seeing was different. Running through the center of the room, from the entry point to the far wall, was a path. A section where debris had been repeatedly displaced, pushed to either side and then partially resettled by time. Not recent disturbance, but regular enough, and over a long enough period that the pattern had not fully recovered. The floor was telling a story about someone who had walked that exact route many times. He followed the path with his eyes to the far wall. There was a door, closed. In a derelict building, a closed interior door is not the norm. Over time, doors in abandoned structures are pushed open by structural shift, corrode off their hinges, or are simply knocked flat. A door that is still closed means one of two things. It has corroded permanently shut, or someone closed it deliberately. Andrew pushed it open. The room behind it was small, roughly 12 feet by 12 feet, with no windows. His headlamp reached all four walls immediately. In the far corner, organized against the wall with a care and deliberateness that he found immediately jarring, were supplies. Not rusted facility equipment, not materials from the operating era, current items. 2 sealed water containers. A folded thermal blanket still in its retail packaging. Several cans of food with clean, legible labels and intact pull tabs. And sitting on top of the stack, placed there as though for easy access, a handheld, two-way radio of the type sold at any outdoor sporting goods retailer. Andrew stood in that doorway for a long time. He told me he is not sure exactly how long, but long enough that the light from his headlamp started to feel intrusive, like he was looking at something that had been arranged in darkness and was not meant to be seen. The supplies were not scattered or hidden. They were organized, stacked. The water containers side by side, level. The food cans in a row. The blanket folded with the packaged edge facing outward. It had the look of a space that was maintained, returned to, checked on. The kind of order you only bother to keep if you're planning to come back. James appeared through the window opening shortly afterward. Andrew brought him into the building and walked him to the room. He watched James look at the supplies, and then James said, without asking a single clarifying question about what he was looking at, "We need to finish up and get back to the boat." Not, "What is this doing here?" Not, "Who does this belong to?" Not, "We need to document this and notify someone before we move." Just, "We need to leave." Andrew pushed back. He asked whether anything similar had come up on James's preliminary visit 8 months prior. James said no. Andrew asked who else had authorized access to the site. James said, to his knowledge, Only the remediation project contractors? Andrew pointed out that someone clearly had access, and that those supplies were not 8 months old. James looked at them again briefly, then said for the second time that they needed to go. They were halfway back to the dock when both of them stopped walking at the same moment. From the direction of the northern end of the island, from the cluster of structures they had just come from, there was a sound, low and rhythmic. Andrew's first instinct was to file it as a boat engine because that was the closest familiar category, but it was not mechanical. It did not have the variance and inconsistency of an engine running. It was too even, too regular. A slow cycling pulse of sound that sat just below easy hearing, felt through the soles of his boots as much as through his ears. James was standing very still beside him. He was looking at the tree line and not saying anything. They covered the remaining distance to the dock at a pace Andrew describes as controlled urgency. He filed a full report, including a written addendum about the room, the supplies, the debris track, and the sound, along with all photographs from that section of the site. He was thorough about it. He wrote it up the same evening while the details were still sharp and attached it formally to the Maine assessment documentation. He requested escalation to a formal follow-up investigation. He was told the information would be forwarded appropriately. He followed up twice over the following month and received confirmation both times that the matter was being looked into. He received no further communication after that. The remediation project was completed. The island, as far as Andrew could determine, was cleared and processed and closed out. No public record mentioned the room or what was found inside it. He and James have seen each other at professional events twice since this happened. Both times Andrew has tried to bring it up. Both times James has changed the subject with a speed and decisiveness that Andrew says tells him everything he needs to know about whether James has forgotten it. Here is the part Andrew cannot let go of. Those supplies were not remnants of a single visit. They were staged with the logic of a position intended to be returned to. The thermal blanket was still packaged, not used, but stored carefully for future use. The radio was placed on top of the stack, within easy reach. That is how you kit out a location you operate from regularly. Someone was using that room on a restricted, monitored, supposedly empty island as an operational base, and the foot traffic pattern in the debris on the floor told Andrew that they had been doing so for long enough to wear a permanent path into the building. What it was for is the question Andrew says he will never answer, and the question he says he finds more disturbing than any other. When he and James left that dock and crossed back to the mainland, what came out of that building and checked that the supplies were still where they had been left? The third and final story is the one that has stayed with me the longest since it was submitted. It is also the hardest to verify on the surface, and I want to be upfront about that. But the man who sent it, I will call him Dan, spent over 30 years as a licensed marine surveyor working the Gulf Coast, Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas. He provided route documentation from the day in question. He is not someone whose professional life accommodates carelessness about observable facts. He's not someone who gets turned around on the water, and what he describes has no explanation he finds acceptable after more than a decade of looking for one. I want you to hold on to something before we get into Dan's account. In both of the previous stories, there was a structure A building, a room, 4 walls, and a floor that someone had chosen and prepared and returned to. What makes the third story different is that there was none of that. No rental, no facility, no constructed space, just open water, an unmarked shoreline, and a geographic feature that the official record insists was never there. Whatever Dan encountered, it left almost no physical trace. And the person he saw at the end of it left no trace at all. I have been on the water for most of my adult life, Dan wrote. I know the Gulf the way other people know their own street. I say that so you understand what it means when I tell you that what happened to me on a Tuesday in October, in the fall of the year I turned 52, is something I have never been able to account for. I have tried. I have the route logs. I have the coordinates. I have replayed every decision I made that day more times than I can count. And I still cannot explain it. He was running a solo survey route through a section of the Louisiana Barrier Island chain. He had covered that stretch of water dozens of times. He had contributed to the charting of part of it earlier in his career. About 2 hours into the run, his engine developed a fuel line problem. Not catastrophic. He had dealt with the same issue before, but enough that he did not want to push the boat further without fixing it first. His chart showed a stable landing point about 4 miles ahead, a barrier island with a sheltered shoreline and enough flat ground to work comfortably. He adjusted course toward it. What he found was not on his chart. He is very clear and very deliberate about this. He had current NOAA charts on board. He had satellite imagery overlay active on his navigation system. He had been through that specific section of water 18 months prior on a similar run. There was no island at that position on any of those references. But there it was in front of him, low to the waterline, 3 feet of elevation at the highest point, covered in marsh grass and coastal scrub, roughly a half mile in length. In a Louisiana coastal environment, sediment features can migrate significantly over 18 months. He knew that, he accounted for it, he told himself that was what this was, and he brought the boat in and anchored in the shallows. He anchored in the shallows and waded ashore. The water was warm for October, he noted that specifically. Warmer than it should have been that far from the Maine channel. He filed it away the way surveyors file everything. Observed, logged, not yet explained. The first thing he noticed when he waded ashore was the silence. Not the comfortable quiet of open water, which always has something in it. Wind, the calls of birds, the low percussion of the Gulf in the distance. This was a different kind of silence. Structural, complete. There were pelicans resting on the water on both sides of the island. He counted them because that is the kind of mind he has. Not one of them had landed on the island itself. The shoreline was the obvious resting spot, flat and undisturbed, and every bird was avoiding it. He noticed that explicitly and filed it away and kept working. He began the engine repair. He had the tools. He knew the procedure. He estimated 45 minutes. While he worked with his hands, he kept his eyes moving across the interior of the island. The grass was bent, not by wind. The day was nearly calm with a light southerly breeze, and wind bends grass in consistent directional patterns. These were curves, long gradual arcs through the vegetation along specific routes, consistent with something moving through it deliberately and repeatedly. He had seen deer trails in marsh grass before. He had seen paths worn down by repeated human foot traffic before. What he was looking at was closer to the second than the first. He could not explain how a footpath existed on a feature that his charts said was not there. Midway through the repair, the smell reached him. Wood smoke. Faint, but absolutely clean and unmistakable. He has a strong nose, and he is precise about the difference between smoke carried on a wind from a distant source and smoke that is local, still hanging in the air near where it was made. The breeze was coming from the south. The mainland was to the north. Whatever had been burned on that island, and recently enough that the smell was still present in the air around him. He finished the repair faster than he has ever completed that job before. He was not in a panic. He uses those words himself, and I believe him. He was moving with the specific, focused intention of someone who has processed the available information and made a decision. The whole time he worked, he kept scanning the scrub line. He saw no movement. He heard nothing beyond the water and his own hands on the engine. But he felt, and he is precise about this too, a man who almost never speaks in terms of feeling, he felt the particular animal brain certainty that something in the interior of that island was oriented toward him, waiting, watching to see what he would do next. He got the engine running. He pulled the anchor. He put distance between himself and that shore. When he was about 200 yards out, he turned and looked back. There was a person standing at the water's edge. He keeps the specifics of what he saw very tight because he has revisited them so many times that he does not want to let any detail drift. A human figure, standing still, facing the boat. He could not resolve any specific characteristics at that distance. Height, clothing, age, none of it. Just the unmistakable shape of a person standing at the exact point where the grass met the water line, watching him go. Not moving, not calling out, not signaling in any way. Just watching with a stillness that he found more disturbing than any movement would have been. He radioed it in at the next manned station. He reported the position, the uncharted feature, the signs of habitation, and the figure. The response was professional, courteous, and completely empty of any real acknowledgement. The position would be noted. The information would be passed to the relevant survey office. He followed up 3 times over the following weeks. The final response he received stated that a routine aerial survey of the area had been conducted, and no feature consistent with his description had been located at the reported coordinates. An island he had stood on, that he had waded ashore onto, that he had smelled and heard and fixed an engine on, was not there when someone went looking for it. He offers 3 explanations in his account, and he is honest about the fact that he dislikes all of them. 1. Tidal and sediment dynamics caused the feature to form and then dissolve in the gap between his visit and the aerial survey. He calls this possible, but considers the timeline too short for a feature of that size. 2. He has the position wrong, degraded by the stress of a mechanical problem. He calls this the most professionally uncomfortable possibility and the one he finds the least credible given his experience. 3. Someone did not want that island to be on any official record, and they had the means to make sure it was not. He retired 3 years after that run. He has returned to that section of the Gulf twice since, both times with his adult son on recreational trips. He has not found the island again. He has not been able to account for the figure standing at the water's edge. And the thing he says in the closing lines of his account is this: "I do not know who that was, but they were there. They were standing at the edge of a place that the official record says does not exist, watching me leave. And they were not hiding. That is the part I cannot resolve. They could see me looking back at them, and they did not move. They stood there and watched me go, like they already knew I would not be coming back. 3 islands, 3 people who came home carrying something they were not expecting and have not been able to put down. A woman who heard a voice through a locked door at 2 a.m. from someone with no right to be there, and a cover story already prepared. An engineer who found an active, organized supply cache in a building on a restricted and supposedly empty site, and a partner who refused to discuss it the moment they left. A surveyor who anchored at an island his charts said was not there, smelled a fire, found paths worn into the grass, and watched a figure watch him from the shore until he was out of sight across open water. I have been thinking about what connects these 3 accounts since I first read them. And the answer I keep arriving at is not the islands themselves, or even what was on them. It is the response of the systems that were supposed to care. The rental platform that noted the concern and went quiet. The partner who changed the subject at 2 separate industry events over 2 separate years. The survey office that sent 1 flyover and closed the file. In every single one of these cases, the institution that received the report did the minimum it could do and no more. And I do not think that is coincidence. I think that is a pattern, and patterns have causes. But more than any of that, the thing I keep coming back to is what Emily said, that the knock on her door was casual, patient, unhurried, like someone who was used to waiting, like someone who had stood on that porch before and already knew what the silence on the other side of the door meant. That is not the behavior of someone afraid of being caught. That is the behavior of someone who knows they are not going anywhere. Someone who understands in a way that their visitor does not yet, that the water surrounding that island is not just geography, it is a boundary, and they are on the inside of it. Whatever is out there on those islands, it has had a long time to learn how to wait. It knows which cottages book on short notice and which ones the owners manage remotely without ever setting foot there. It knows which facilities have restricted access and which buildings do not appear on low priority assessment lists and which rooms have no exterior visibility. It knows which sections of the Gulf Coast shift fast enough that a feature can appear and disappear between survey visits and leave no official trace. It is patient in the way that only something very old or very practiced can be patient. It does not need you to stay. It only needs to know that you were there, and that the next time someone books that cottage, contracts that site, or anchors in those shallows, they will arrive the same way you did, without knowing what is already waiting for them. Every one of our narrators eventually left. They packed their bags or pulled their anchors or took the morning ferry back to everything ordinary and familiar. And whatever was out there on those islands stayed. It is still there tonight. Right now, while you are watching this, in whatever room you are sitting in, those islands are dark and quiet, and the water around them is still. And something is standing at the waterline, looking out across the distance at the lights of the mainland to exits. And it is not afraid of how far away they are. It knows that the ferry runs both ways. If tonight's stories got under your skin, hit the like button before you close out of this video. It takes 1 second and it genuinely helps more people find this channel and find these accounts. And these accounts deserve to be found. Drop a comment below and tell me which of the 3 stories stayed with you the longest. Was it Emily and the knock that came at 2 in the morning? Andrew and the room that someone had been maintaining in secret? Or Dan and the figure standing at the edge of an island that was not supposed to exist? I read every comment and I always respond to as many as I can, so let me know. And if you are new to Silent Fear and you have not subscribed yet, please do it right now before you forget. Hit that button below, turn on the notification bell so you do not miss an upload, and come back for the next one. New stories go up regularly, and some of what is coming is going to be unlike anything we have covered before. You do not want to miss it. Stay safe out there. Keep the lights on,